Some people enter history not as heroes, but as questions. They leave no grand speeches, no monuments, no official biography to frame their legacy. Instead, they move through the margins, half seen, half understood, yet their presence quietly alters everything, not because they sought power, but because they came too close to something others were trying to forget. Pellegrino Ernetti was one of them. His name appears nowhere in school books. His face was never broadcast to the world. And yet, for those who encountered him, or stumbled into the trail he left behind, he became the center of a story too strange to ignore and too dangerous to prove. He did not claim to be a prophet. He rarely spoke in absolutes. What he offered, instead, was something more unsettling, the suggestion that time was not what people believed it to be. He never said it directly, but the way he moved, the way he measured silence, made it clear. He had seen something real, something that hadn't let him go. Before his appearance, history had always been treated as a construct, a story assembled from fragments, filtered through interpretation and belief. But Ernetti carried a different idea entirely, that the past had not vanished, that it was still there, every moment of it, echoing just beyond perception, waiting. The idea wasn't new. Ancient myths spoke of memory that never faded, of divine vision, of scrolls that could reveal all things. But Ernetti hinted at something not mythic, not symbolic, but mechanical, something built, a receiver, a mirror, a machine, not one that traveled through time, one that listened. And once such a machine existed, everything changed. Belief became optional. Secrets became obsolete. History ceased to be a debate and became surveillance. He did not force this knowledge on anyone. He never stood on a podium demanding belief. But those who listened closely began to understand that his silence was not emptiness. It was burden. It was the weight of knowing that what had been witnessed could not be undone. Let us pause here. There are few things more haunting than a story that refuses to resolve, and this, by all measures, is one of them. For those listening now, after a long day, in quiet search of something that cannot be named, perhaps that unresolved hum is familiar. A need for stillness, yes, but also a need for wonder. If that is what draws someone into this tale, then let it be enough. No need for certainty. No need to subscribe to more than the question itself. If one wished to invent a story so outlandish it would be dismissed as fiction, there would be no better protagonist than Father Pellegrino Ernetti. He was a man who seemed almost designed for contradiction. At once, a monk devoted to prayer and tradition, and a scientist who spoke of waves, harmonics, and subatomic phenomena. A man who cast out demons by morning and read ancient musical notation by night. To those who met him, he exuded both serenity and intensity. But beneath it all was something harder to define, an unshakable sense that he had seen something others had not. Ernetti was born in 1925, in the aftermath of one world war and on the doorstep of another. From an early age, he felt the call toward faith, eventually becoming a Benedictine monk. But faith alone did not define him. He immersed himself in music, specifically the music of ancient times, before the polyphony of later centuries, before the harmonies of the Renaissance. He became a scholar of pre-polyphonic chant, a field so obscure and technical that few outside the academic elite even knew it existed. Within this niche, Ernetti shone brightly. He published, he taught, He developed new ways to interpret and reconstruct long-lost liturgical sounds. His talent was so profound that the Vatican eventually appointed him as a delegate for sacred music, a title few could ever claim. But his mind was never still. Alongside his ecclesiastical responsibilities, Ernetti studied ancient languages, theology, and even physics. In time, he earned degrees in philosophy and quantum mechanics, a rare pairing, even by the standards of polymaths. By all accounts, he did not pursue these disciplines for prestige. Those who knew him best described him as quiet, humble, deeply focused. His motivations, they said, were never ambition, but understanding. And that was what made him dangerous. It was not unusual for priests to pursue academic excellence. The Church had, after all, preserved knowledge for centuries when the rest of Europe was drowning in ignorance. But there was something different about Ernetti, something that, even then, began to draw whispers. For 40 years, he served as one of Italy's most respected exorcists. Thousands sought him out, and hundreds came to him each week for help with ailments no doctor could diagnose. Yet even in that capacity, Ernetti approached the world scientifically. He drew sharp lines between psychological disorders and what he considered genuine cases of possession. To him, the supernatural and the rational were not at war. They were layers, overlapping frequencies of the same cosmic music. He even wrote about it. In a little-known work titled The Likes and Dislikes of the Devil, Ernetti described his experiences from the first-person perspective of evil itself. In that voice, he outlined the ways modern inventions, including the television, could be used to fracture families, distract the clergy, and disrupt spiritual life. Whether one interpreted the text metaphorically or literally, it offered a chilling reflection. The very technology we build to connect us could just as easily become the instrument of our undoing. And then there were the rumors, barely spoken, never printed, that when he was not teaching music or performing exorcisms, Ernetti spent long hours in his cell tinkering with electronics. That he received strange visitors, some of them scientists, others officials. That certain parts of the monastery had been closed off for months at a time, sealed behind thick wooden doors, behind which faint lights and unfamiliar hums could sometimes be heard. All of this might have remained rumor had it not been for one word that began to circulate among a few of Ernetti's closest contacts. A word that carried no meaning for most, but for those who had heard him speak in confidence, it was a cipher for something far greater, Chronovisor. To Brune, the more he learned of Ernetti, the more unsettling the picture became. This was no delusional fantasist. This was a man of immense discipline, intellect, and credibility. A man who had everything to lose and nothing to gain by entertaining a lie. And yet, everything pointed toward one inescapable conclusion. Ernetti had either built a machine capable of viewing the past, or he believed, with absolute conviction, that he had. The question that haunted Brune, and would soon come to haunt many others, was simple but impossible. Could he be right? The very idea was heretical in some circles, fantastical in others. Yet Ernetti's life was devoid of the hallmarks of a hoax. He never sought profit. He never published for attention. He guarded the story for decades, revealing it only to those he trusted, and even then, only in pieces. This was not the behavior of a charlatan. It was the behavior of a man afraid of the truth he had touched. And yet, if the chronovisor was real, if it had even partially worked, then its implications would exceed even the boldest imaginations. Such a machine would upend not only theology, but history, law, politics, memory itself. It would not just show events as they happened. It would unmask myths, expose deception, dissolve privacy. Nothing would be safe, not ancient dogma, nor personal sin. It was the kind of invention that, if successful, would immediately be seen as a threat by those who valued control. The Church, for all its spiritual mission, was also an institution. Like all institutions, it had records it preferred unread, moments it preferred unexamined. A device that could strip away centuries of mystery with the flick of a switch would be both a miracle and a menace. And so, if the Chronovisor did exist, it would almost certainly have been buried. This was the paradox Brune struggled with. The only man who could have built such a device was a man like Ernetti. And yet, the only man trustworthy enough to tell the truth about it was also a man bound by vows of secrecy, silence, and service to a higher authority. Brune would later write that speaking with Ernetti felt like walking through a cathedral of mirrors. Every answer opened into another question, every certainty fractured under scrutiny. And always, at the center of the maze, was the same figure, a priest in black robes, his eyes lit not by madness, but by something more dangerous, hope. During his visits to the monastery, Brune often observed how little Ernetti seemed to care about being believed. He shared his story not to convince, but to release it, like a burden he could no longer carry alone. And yet, even in his disclosures, there were boundaries. Names were withheld. Details were veiled. It was as if Ernetti had been permitted only to say so much, and no more. Brune suspected, and would one day confirm, that this was not merely personal caution. It was institutional constraint. The Vatican, it seemed, knew far more than it let on. But that part of the story would come later. For now, the focus remained on the man himself, a man who seemed to belong to multiple centuries at once, a man who could cast out demons, speak ancient tongues, reanimate forgotten music, and, perhaps, glimpse the past as if it had never left. The man who looked through time. And as Brune would come to understand, Ernetti's story was only just beginning. In the years that followed, Brune would chase this story like a pilgrim pursues a relic, not out of blind faith, but from the aching need to know whether what he had glimpsed in that monastery was real. Not merely an invention of imagination, but the edge of a deeper map, a cartography of time drawn in silence and hidden from the world. What kind of world might exist if time could be watched like film? And more unsettling, who among us already knows that it can? The next chapter would not answer these questions. It would only make them harder to ignore. Venice has always existed slightly outside of time. Its alleyways and canals defy straight lines. Its waters reflect more sky than ground, and its buildings lean with the fatigue of centuries. Even the air feels different, laden with salt, incense, and stories too old to belong to any one century. For Father Francois Brune, it was the perfect city for something impossible to begin. In the spring of 1964, as tourists wandered under Gothic arches and gondoliers hummed familiar songs, a moment unfolded quietly on the edge of the Grand Canal. Two men waited for a Vaporetto, Venice's public water bus, beneath a midday sun that shimmered against the water like molten glass. To passers-by, they were simply two priests, one French, one Italian. Nothing about them drew attention, but in retrospect, that moment has come to resemble something else entirely. the spark before revelation. Brune remembered it in vivid fragments. The way the water lapped against stone, the smell of fish and wet brick, the subtle glance Ernetti gave before speaking. And then, with what seemed like casual politeness, Ernetti had asked about Brune's work, what he studied, how he approached Scripture, not as if he were curious, but as if he were measuring something beneath the words. Brune, never one to withhold opinion, confessed his growing frustration with the trend of viewing the Gospels solely through symbolic or metaphorical lenses. He described his unease at how modern scholars dismissed miracles as pedagogical fiction, reducing the sacred into allegory. He spoke of his worry that in the race to intellectualize faith, something essential was being lost. He would later write that Ernetti listened with what seemed like quiet recognition, as though he had heard this lament before, not just from others, but perhaps from himself. And then, just as the boat approached, Ernetti made a remark that would alter the course of Brune's life. He suggested that perhaps there was a way to resolve these tensions, a way to move beyond interpretation altogether. If one could witness the events of the past directly, then ambiguity would vanish. There would be no need for allegory if one could see the truth as it occurred. Then, without elaboration, he stepped aboard the vaporetto and drifted away across the canal, leaving Brune suspended between disbelief and fascination. What was he implying? A metaphor? A riddle? Or had he spoken plainly, and Brune simply failed to grasp the scale? That night, Brune barely slept. The idea churned inside him. As a theologian, he had long wrestled with the question of interpretation. As a priest, he had counseled believers torn between modern doubt and ancient conviction. But never had he imagined a solution so literal, so absolute. A device that could observe time itself. The next day, Brune accepted Ernetti's invitation and traveled to the island monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore. The building rose like a quiet sentinel against the skyline, its white stone glowing faintly in the Venetian sun. Inside, shadows draped across arched corridors, and the air carried the hush of long-kept secrets. Ernetti greeted him with gentle formality. No dramatics, no immediate revelations. They walked together through the cloister, their steps muted on the worn stone floors. Eventually, they entered a large room, a study of sorts, cluttered with books and papers, aged furniture, and a heavy table that looked as though it had never been moved. The ceiling arched above them, like the hull of an upturned ship, and high-backed chairs offered both comfort and restraint. Brune described the setting later as almost theatrical. A stage without audience, a space where something important had either just occurred or was about to. They sat. At first, their conversation stayed grounded in the familiar. Family histories, academic pursuits, areas of mutual study. Ernetti asked thoughtful questions, probing gently, as if seeking the boundaries of Brune's skepticism. Brune, for his part, tried not to rush the moment, though he could feel it hovering just beneath the surface. And then time began to stretch. Minutes passed. Then hours. The sun outside began to shift, casting long slashes of light through the narrow windows. Still, Ernetti avoided returning to the subject he had teased the day before. Eventually, Brune could no longer remain passive. He asked directly about the device, what it was, what it did, and why Ernetti had mentioned it. The monk became still. Something behind his eyes changed. Not fear, exactly, but a withdrawal. A weighing of consequence. It was, Brune sensed, the moment where trust would either be extended or withheld. What followed was not yet a revelation, but rather a prelude. Ernetti began to share a memory, one he considered foundational to everything that would come later. Not every revelation arrives with thunder. Some creep in softly, disguised as technical failures or subtle anomalies. In the case of Father Pellegrino Ernetti, the turning point that would shape his life's most extraordinary pursuit did not occur in the depths of an exorcism or in the margins of ancient texts. It happened in a laboratory. A lab filled not with machines of prophecy or portals to other dimensions, but with little more than a wire recorder and two skeptical minds trying to purify the sound of chant. It was 1952, Milan. In a modest university setting, Ernetti was working alongside Father Agostino Gemelli, a fellow priest and a man of formidable intellect. Their task was simple in principle, complex in execution: to isolate the harmonic structure of Gregorian chants using a wire recorder, which at the time was the most advanced audio technology available. Their interest was purely academic, an attempt to understand how spiritual music functioned on a technical, acoustic level. They had no intention of contacting the dead. The session unfolded as many before it had. Chant recordings were played, frequencies filtered, notes logged. But then the recorder malfunctioned. In a moment of frustration, Gemelli muttered something aloud, a habitual phrase, one he'd spoken since he was a boy, calling instinctively to his deceased father in a mixture of exasperation and longing. The response did not come from Ernetti. It came from the wire recorder. At first, they thought it was interference, some errant frequency bleeding in. But when they replayed the tape, the voice came again. Clear, calm, unmistakable. It used a name known only to Gemelli's childhood, a private nickname no outsider could have invented. It offered reassurance. It claimed to still be present. What they had captured was not just sound. It was memory made audible. Grief turned electromagnetic. Gemelli, startled, wanted to destroy the recording, to shut it down and walk away. But Ernetti, already moved by a deeper instinct, urged him to let it play again, to listen without fear. They had not summoned the voice. It had arrived on its own. And if it had arrived once, perhaps it had always been there, simply waiting for the right device to catch it. The implications were staggering. To speak with the dead had always been the province of mystics, frauds, or the damned. But here it was, emerging not through candles or seances, but through scientific instrumentation. Not metaphor, not hallucination. A physical, repeatable phenomenon. They reported it immediately. The Vatican, far from panicking, received the account with a strange calm. Pope Pius XII himself was said to have offered comfort to the two priests, assuring them that what they had encountered was not heresy, but a glimpse of deeper physical law. Sound, he reminded them, did not simply vanish. It echoed, it scattered, it persisted. And if sound could persist, what else might? For Ernetti, this was the spark. The moment that collapsed the boundaries between his many worlds: science, theology, liturgy, metaphysics. He began to see sound not as a fleeting phenomenon, but as a carrier of time itself. The chants he studied were not mere performances, but temporal fingerprints, etched into the air by voices long since silenced. And if the past left traces in the present, echoes embedded in space, then perhaps nothing was ever truly lost. He revisited Scripture with new eyes. In Genesis, creation itself begins with vibration. God said, and the world was. Was this literal? Could the entire cosmos be composed of waves, launched by divine voice and sustained through infinite resonance? If the word could birth the universe, then perhaps all things, matter, memory, history, were nothing more than stabilized vibration, frozen music, accessible, if only one knew how to listen. Thus emerged the foundation of what would become his life's most secretive endeavor, the Chronovisor. Brune, years later, would reflect on how logical it all sounded in Ernetti's voice. The monk was not manic or conspiratorial. He spoke with the clarity of someone who had walked the halls of paradox for so long that he no longer found them disorienting. Everything had led to this. Theology and physics were not opposing disciplines. They were lenses looking at the same truth from different angles. The early experiments with Gregorian chant became something else entirely. Ernetti continued working with Gemelli for a time, but he began to draw away, consumed by a question that no musical notation could answer. If the past leaves echoes, could those echoes be collected, assembled, and made visible? He hypothesized that if sound waves could be caught, then perhaps light waves, image itself, might also remain. Not just in recordings or shadows, but imprinted in the quantum fabric of the world. Trapped, looping in space, beyond the reach of the naked eye, but not beyond all perception. What if there was a frequency not only for voices, but for vision? A hidden channel, always broadcasting, forever missed. The possibility obsessed him. He began to study quantum mechanics more rigorously, seeking clues in wave-particle duality, in the conservation of energy, in the theory that information in the universe is never destroyed, only transformed. From these principles, a speculative device began to form in his imagination. A machine, not of fantasy, but of deeply reasoned design. Not one that manipulated time, but one that retrieved it. The Chronovisor, as he later called it, would not send people into the past. It would not cause paradoxes or unravel causality. It would simply act as a receiver, tuning into the persistent echoes of time and reassembling them into viewable, audible form. Like a radio that could tune into yesterday's broadcast, or a lens that could refocus the light of centuries past. But for such a machine to exist, it would need precision unimaginable to ordinary engineers. It would require an understanding not only of physics, but of resonance, field theory, and human identity. Because, Ernetti believed, every individual carried a unique vibrational signature, like a spiritual fingerprint. To track the past, the Chronovisor would not scan general locations or timestamps. It would lock onto people. It would follow the specific resonance of a single life as it moved through time. Brune, in those early discussions, was stunned by the level of detail. The concept sounded at once impossible and obvious. If nothing is ever truly lost, then why should the past be inaccessible? If the world is a chamber of echoes, then the only missing element is the right kind of ear. Still, he held back his full belief. Ernetti offered no schematics, no demonstrations, only language, rich in imagery, wrapped in silence. And yet the conviction was unmistakable. The way Ernetti spoke, it was clear that he was not imagining this device. He was remembering it. As Brune listened, a strange image came to his mind, one he never voiced at the time. He imagined a vast cathedral of sound, each moment of history ringing out like a bell. In the center stood a monk, tuning an invisible dial, his fingers adjusting frequencies no one else could hear. Around him, the past came alive, Not as story, not as symbol, but as raw presence. And then the image faded. For now, there was only theory, only the harmonic residue of something greater. But soon, Ernetti would speak not of what might be, but of what had already been done. What Brune didn't yet realize was that the story he had just heard was not the origin of a theory. It was the prologue to a project that, according to Ernetti, had already been attempted, already tested, already glimpsed. It had begun not with speculation, but with circuitry, and not in imagination, but in secret laboratories whose blueprints had never seen daylight. The Chronovisor was no longer a dream. If Ernetti was telling the truth, it had once existed. And what it revealed would defy not only history, but the very nature of human certainty. By the time Father Ernetti revealed the next layer of his story, Brune had already accepted a few unthinkable premises: that the past might be retrievable, that waveforms may persist across centuries, and that the boundary between theology and science was far thinner than most believed. But nothing he had heard up to that point had prepared him for what Ernetti claimed next. The Chronovisor, Ernetti finally admitted, had been built, not in theory, not on paper, but physically, tangibly, secretly. It had taken years, he explained, and the collaboration of 12 individuals drawn from across the scientific and academic world, each chosen for a specific expertise, each sworn to silence. What they created was not a time machine in the fantastical sense. It was, instead, a window, a receiver, a device engineered to detect, isolate, and reassemble the ambient electromagnetic echoes of historical events. The room in which they met, Ernetti said, was never the same twice. Sometimes it was a physics lab, sometimes a sealed chamber. Occasionally, even the rooms of the monastery itself became temporary workshops. Most were unaware of what was being constructed. A few, perhaps, suspected, but never dared to ask. According to Ernetti, the group was assembled under authorization from the Vatican itself. Pope Pius XII, after learning of the anomalous voice recorded in 1952, had expressed a cautious interest. He saw in the incident not a threat to faith, but a possible reinforcement of it. After all, if the words of Christ could be retrieved, if the actual scenes of the crucifixion could be witnessed, then the core of Christian doctrine might no longer rest on belief, but on vision. The implications were staggering. And so, with papal approval and a mandate of absolute discretion, Ernetti began to recruit. Some names were lost to history, others deliberately withheld, but a few he shared with Brune, carefully, as if offering sacred artifacts. Among them was Enrico Fermi, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist known for his work in quantum theory, nuclear reactions, and the development of the atomic bomb. Fermi's name alone carried the weight of scientific authority. That he would be involved in something so unorthodox suggested one of two things. Either the theory had true merit, or the Vatican's reach extended into domains most assumed to be secular. Another name was Wernher von Braun, the former Nazi rocket scientist turned American aerospace engineer, whose work for NASA had launched the Saturn V rocket and helped land humans on the moon. Von Braun's expertise was mechanical, but his ambitions had always touched the stars. That he might lend his mind to a machine for looking into the past was both ironic and deeply fitting. A Japanese Nobel laureate, unnamed by Ernetti but likely Hideki Yukawa, was also said to have contributed, offering insights into particle theory and wave propagation. From Portugal, another physicist, Professor de Matos, provided expertise in the disintegration of sound according to ancient Greek texts. Each man brought a different key. Together, they were building something that had never existed, something that perhaps never should. The Vatican, Ernetti explained, did not coordinate the project directly. Rather, it facilitated access, provided funding through discrete channels, and ensured the scientists could meet without drawing attention. The operation was hidden in plain sight, cloaked under the guise of musical research, historical studies, and religious scholarship. And yet, despite the secrecy, the team made progress. The Chronovisor, Ernetti explained, consisted of three primary components. First was an array of specially constructed antennas, engineered from exotic alloys that could absorb a wide spectrum of electromagnetic frequencies. These antennas were configured not just to detect ambient radiation, but to capture remnants of specific signal patterns, echoes left behind by human presence. The second component was a selector mechanism, capable of isolating specific time periods, locations, and individuals. This element, Ernetti said, worked by tuning the machine to the unique vibrational signature of a person or place. Once the signature was locked, the device could trace its residual path through time, like a radio tracking the fading signal of a distant transmitter. The third component was a viewing module, a screen, not unlike a cathode ray television, that reassembled the captured data into visual and auditory form. Images appeared in black and white, roughly life-sized, accompanied by sound. The effect, Ernetti claimed, was something between a hologram and a film. Real, but bounded by the machine's constraints. Brune listened in silence, struck not just by the content of the revelation, but by the tone with which it was delivered. Ernetti was not boasting. There was no triumph in his voice, only gravity, as if the burden of knowledge had long since replaced the thrill of discovery. The machine, he insisted, had worked. They had tested it on recent events at first, well-documented speeches, public gatherings, so that results could be compared to known records. Mussolini delivering an address, Napoleon in ceremonial garb. These early attempts helped calibrate the Chronovisor's sensitivity. Once confirmed, they reached further. The group traveled backward through history, not physically, but observationally, until they arrived at moments unrecorded by any other means. Ancient Rome, the trial of Jesus, lost performances of Greek tragedies, entire lifetimes replayed like shadows made of signal and light. Ernetti said that the device did not merely show scenes. It followed individuals. Once a person's unique vibrational resonance was isolated, the machine could track their actions across space and time, rendering them observable from a third-person perspective. It was as though reality itself had become a theater, with history unfolding on demand. And yet, despite all this, the Chronovisor was dismantled. Why? This was the question Brune asked with the most urgency. If the device was functional, if it could prove foundational truths, or correct centuries of error, why destroy it? Ernetti offered no single answer, but many. The device, he said, was too powerful, not in the way of weapons, but in its capacity to erase secrecy. Nothing could be hidden. No conversation, no decision, no mistake. Governments would fall. Economies could collapse. Every lie ever told would be traceable. Every private moment reviewable. They had even used it, on one occasion, to detect a planned robbery. The criminals were stopped, but the implications were chilling. If surveillance of the past was possible, then so was the annihilation of privacy. There would be no secrets, no refuge, no inner world. It was, in effect, the end of human interiority. Some of the team believed this was progress. Others saw it as a step toward tyranny, a form of total observation that would destroy the human spirit under the weight of infinite exposure. Brune understood. For a device capable of perfect witness, the greatest danger was not that it would be misused, but that it would be used exactly as designed. And so, the decision was made. The Chronovisor was taken apart, its components separated, its blueprints sealed. Copies were allegedly entrusted to notaries in Switzerland and Japan, and one held within the Vatican. Whether any of them still exist is unknown. To this day, no physical evidence has surfaced. Only the story remains. A story that feels, in many ways, like a ghost. Present, persistent, but always just out of reach. And yet, what they had seen through that screen could not be unseen. Ernetti confessed that the images had stayed with him, not as memories, but as burdens. To see the past was not simply to witness, it was to carry, to feel the weight of history's silence, and realize it had only been quiet because we lacked the ears to hear it. For Brune, the pieces were beginning to cohere. This was no longer a question of if. It was a question of how long such a truth could remain buried, and who had the most to lose should it ever emerge. Because if a device could see into the past, then what might it reveal about the most sacred moments in human history? And what if the revelations it offered were not what we were taught to believe? There is a difference between believing something happened and seeing it unfold before your eyes. Faith, no matter how deeply held, is always a negotiation between what we feel and what we can prove. But what happens when proof arrives? Uninvited, unsoftened, and absolute. That was the question Brune could no longer escape. For years, he had been trained to navigate the space between historical evidence and religious tradition. But when Ernetti finally began to speak, not of the machine's theory or design, but of its results, something in Brune shifted irreversibly. This was not theology anymore. It was witness testimony, a viewing of the past, recorded not in memory or scripture, but in electromagnetic residue rendered visible. Ernetti described the first real trials of the Chronovisor not as moments of triumph, but as tests of balance. The team had agreed to begin cautiously. They selected recent historical events, not just for calibration, but for verification. Mussolini's speeches were among the first. The dictator's orations had been widely documented: film reels, audio tapes, written transcripts. By targeting these moments, they could measure the fidelity of what the Chronovisor displayed. What they saw, Ernetti claimed, was accurate to the smallest detail. The gestures, the tone, even the background murmurs of the crowd matched known recordings. Once confirmed, they moved further back. Napoleon delivering military orders, scenes of ancient markets in Rome, the daily rituals of now extinct cities. But even then, the question persisted. Were they watching replays of what had truly happened? Or were they seeing projections shaped by expectation? To answer that, they chose something different. They tuned the device to observe a work of art that no longer existed, a Roman tragedy titled Thyestes, attributed to the poet Quintus Ennius, long believed lost to time. Only fragments survived through citations by other authors. If the Chronovisor could retrieve a performance of that play, if its content matched no existing manuscript, yet held internal coherence. Then it would demonstrate that the machine was not simply reflecting known history, but retrieving hidden strands of it. According to Ernetti, they succeeded. The team isolated the performance, staged in 169 BC, shortly before the playwright's death. The scene unfolded in a Roman theater before a modest audience. Costumes, gestures, rhythm, none of it matched modern reconstructions. Ernetti, fluent in Latin, began transcribing what he heard. Later, he compared it to the few known lines that had survived. The overlap was imperfect, but not contradictory. The new text expanded upon the fragments without violating them. It was, in his words, a rediscovery rather than a recreation. Brune would never see the recording, nor the full transcript, but the implications were enough. If the past could be retrieved in this way, then so could anything else. And so they turned to the most sacred event in all of Christian history. Ernetti did not rush the account. He seemed to carry it with careful reluctance. To him, this was no longer science. This was the edge of sacrilege, and perhaps the end of innocence. They attempted to observe the Passion of Christ. Initially, they expected to locate the event quickly. But the problem was more complex than anticipated. The Roman Empire crucified many. The terrain was unclear, the scene chaotic. They assumed that the crown of thorns would serve as a unique identifier, but to their surprise, it was not unique. Many condemned men were mocked with similar headpieces. Execution was spectacle. Symbolism was repurposed freely. Eventually, they focused instead on the Last Supper, believing it to be a more discrete and temporally defined event. This, Ernetti said, is where the breakthrough occurred. Once they had isolated Christ's vibrational signature, a resonance they described as profoundly distinct, the machine could follow him. They did not simply view snapshots. They followed his movements through the trial, the sentencing, the path to Golgotha, and the crucifixion itself. What they saw did not fully align with Scripture. It did not contradict the Gospels outright, but it introduced nuance, corrections, even, challenging centuries of liturgical art, devotional practice, and theological assumption. Christ, they observed, did not carry the full cross. Only the horizontal beam was tied to his shoulders. His body, savaged by scourging, revealed exposed bone beneath torn flesh, details more visceral than described in any holy text. They saw Simon of Cyrene, the man pressed into service to help carry the beam. But the compassion often attributed to him was, according to the footage, a fiction. He had not volunteered. He was forced. His face, Ernetti recalled, showed reluctance, not piety. The soldiers barked, shoved, threatened. The narrative of shared suffering, central to so many sermons, unraveled under the weight of observational truth. Even the crucifixion itself was different. Christ did not collapse repeatedly as many artists had imagined. He did not speak 7 carefully curated phrases in theatrical cadence. Much of what had been canonized, Ernetti claimed, had been shaped more by theological desire than historical record, and yet none of it made the suffering less. If anything, the realism deepened it. The brutality, the silence, the rawness of his final breath, all of it remained etched into Ernetti's mind like a burn. The machine had not destroyed his faith. It had purified it. But at the same time, it left him uneasy. Because the Christ they observed was not the sanitized figure of Sunday school paintings. He was real, which meant he was different. At one point, Ernetti recalled how the Chronovisor captured a strange phenomenon at the moment of death, a kind of light, not blinding, but otherworldly, emanated from the body, as though illumination were not emitted, but revealed. They described it as akin to alabaster backlit by flame, an inward brilliance made visible. Whether it was metaphor or literal event, none could say. But it changed them. They continued. They watched his reappearances after death. They followed his brief re-entries into the world before the ascension. They recorded all of it. The footage, Ernetti claimed, was shown privately to Pope Pius XII and a select group of scientists and clergy. The reactions were mixed: wonder, awe, fear. Because to watch the past is not the same as reading it. And once the image of Christ becomes data, once his life is reduced to viewable footage, something paradoxical occurs. Faith becomes obsolete, and yet somehow more urgent. Because now you're not dealing with metaphor or liturgy. You're dealing with a man. One who breathed, suffered, resisted, and died. Not for a doctrine, not for a performance, but in history, under a sky as real as ours. Brune struggled with this for years. He believed in Christ. He always had. But something about the clarity disturbed him. Perhaps it was the loss of mystery. Perhaps it was the realization that truth, once stripped of symbol, no longer comforts. It accuses. What haunted him most was not the suffering or the crucifixion. It was the moment when Christ, surrounded by jeering crowds and indifferent soldiers, turned his gaze toward those watching, toward the Chronovisor, toward them, as though he knew, as though he had always known. Ernetti never claimed to understand what that look meant, whether it was accusation or forgiveness, recognition or prophecy. But Brune would later write that in that single moment, through that machine, through time itself, he felt seen in a way no human ever had before. And that was the problem. Because once you've watched the Son of God die, not in painting, not in ritual, but in time, there is no returning to innocence, no safe abstraction. The story becomes too real to ignore and too dangerous to own. The Chronovisor had done what it was built to do. It had revealed the past. But what it showed could never be unshown. Truth, when it finally emerges, rarely does so cleanly. It arrives like floodwater, unpredictable, difficult to contain, and capable of destroying the very structures that once protected it. For years, the Chronovisor had remained a whisper, passed between scholars and priests like contraband insight. But in the early 1970s, the boundary between secrecy and scandal was shattered. The fracture began with a photograph. Father Ernetti, for all his secrecy, eventually made a decision he would spend the rest of his life regretting. Pressured by growing rumors and the unrelenting demands of a journalist named Vincenzo Maddaloni, Ernetti allowed a single image to escape into the world, an image he had long kept hidden, supposedly captured directly from the Chronovisor's viewing screen. It depicted the crucified Christ, head tilted, eyes closed, crowned with thorns, framed in stark monochrome like an icon frozen in electric light. For many, it was the proof they had waited for. At last, a tangible fragment of the machine's power. The image was published in an Italian newspaper in May 1972, alongside bold headlines proclaiming the invention of a device that could photograph the past. The public reaction was immediate. Some were awestruck, others appalled. Theologians debated the theological implications of viewing sacred events through a machine. Scientists scoffed at the lack of reproducibility. And across coffee shops, parishes, and editorial boards, speculation turned into fervor. The photograph circulated rapidly, reprinted, analyzed, dissected. But the glory was short-lived. Within weeks, skeptics identified the image as a near-identical match to a wooden crucifix housed in a sanctuary in Collevalenza. The sculpture, commissioned in the 20th century, bore an uncanny resemblance to the image Ernetti had released. When mirrored horizontally, it appeared indistinguishable. A devotional postcard featuring the statue had been sold for years in religious gift shops. The conclusion was damning. Ernetti's photo, once hailed as breakthrough evidence, was denounced as a fabrication. To critics, it was not merely false. It was an embarrassment, a transparent attempt to deceive. The media turned quickly. Articles labeled him a fraud, a fantasist, even a heretic. His credibility, so carefully preserved over decades, unraveled in days. And yet, Ernetti said nothing. He offered no defense, no clarification. To many, his silence was guilt made audible. But Brune saw something else. To him, the silence was not confession, it was compliance. Years later, when Brune confronted him privately, Ernetti finally spoke, not with defiance, but with resignation. He admitted that the image was not taken from the Chronovisor. It had not been captured from any viewing session, nor presented as such in his original conversation with the journalist. Instead, he had handed over the image in exhaustion, after months of being harassed. He had told the journalist, quite carefully, that the Christ they had seen through the device resembled the figure in the photograph, not that it was the same. The distinction was subtle, but it made all the difference. According to Ernetti, the image was intended only as a metaphor, a visual reference for something he could no longer access. The machine had been dismantled, the footage lost, but the memory remained, and in desperation, he offered the closest visual approximation he could find. It was, he admitted, a mistake. He had underestimated how quickly nuance collapses under public scrutiny. Once the photograph entered the world, it no longer belonged to him. Its meaning, its context, its origin, all of it was devoured by the narrative machine. The scandal served its purpose. Whatever momentum the Chronovisor story had been building was abruptly stopped. The machine was dismissed, its creator disgraced. Questions of theology and metaphysics were replaced by accusations of trickery. The image of Christ, so central, so controversial, had been reduced to a postcard and a punchline. Brune was devastated, not because he had been deceived, but because he hadn't. He knew Ernetti too well. He had spent too many hours in that monastery, listening not to a man who craved attention, but to one who spoke reluctantly, even painfully, of what he believed he had witnessed. And now, the narrative had been rewritten. The world no longer saw a conflicted scholar silenced by his church. They saw a failed magician exposed in his final act. Yet Brune continued his inquiry. In private, Ernetti confessed more. He explained that, following the photograph's release, he had been formally prohibited from speaking further. His superiors had issued direct orders. No more statements, no responses, no clarifications. This, Ernetti told Brune, was why the scandal had been allowed to unfold unchallenged. It served institutional interests. With public credibility collapsed, there was no longer pressure for the Vatican to comment. No further need to conceal what the machine had done. The story had self-destructed neatly and permanently. Brune found this logic almost too perfect. In silence, a device had been built that could unmask the past. In scandal, It had been buried again. This time, not in archives or vaults, but in the disbelief of the masses. The truth had been hidden not through force, but through ridicule. Not through denial, but through discreditation. This was the sin of memory, not the fabrication of lies, but the erasure of inconvenient truths by drowning them in noise. What haunted Brune most was not the image itself, but what followed it. Because in the years after the photograph surfaced, the Vatican's posture changed. Conferences where Ernetti once spoke freely became increasingly rare. Invitations were withdrawn. Appearances curtailed. At one parapsychology congress, Ernetti was expected to discuss the Chronovisor. Instead, he gave a 3-hour lecture on eschatology, death, judgment, the end of all things. He spoke of theology and magic, of prophecy and silence. He never mentioned the machine. Brune watched all this unfold with growing unease. The man who had once carried a cosmic secret had been reshaped into something else, a cautionary tale. A heretic muted by his own exaggeration. A priest who had wandered too far into the past and had failed to return intact. But Brune did not believe the story had ended. The Chronovisor, even dismantled, had not been forgotten. Somewhere in Rome, behind doors marked by silence, the blueprints remained. Copies existed. Records survived. Perhaps even fragments of the machine had been preserved. Antennas, circuits, dials stored in crates marked for permanent quiet. Brune believed, to the very end, that the truth had not been lost. It had only been buried deeper. In time, Ernetti withdrew almost completely from public view. He continued his duties as a priest, his lectures in musicology, his quiet exorcisms. But the man who once spoke of waves beyond time no longer spoke at all. Brune, watching from a distance, came to understand that the greatest danger to forbidden knowledge was not censorship. It was the illusion of disproof. When truth is buried beneath ridicule, the grave never needs a lock. But Brune wasn't ready to bury it, and neither, it seemed, was the man who would later appear with a document in hand, one claiming to hold the last words of Pellegrino Ernetti, spoken from his deathbed. Words that would either redeem everything or destroy what little faith remained. For years, Father Brune had lived with a quiet tension, a tension between the staggering implications of what he had heard and the absolute absence of proof. He had spoken with Ernetti many times, watched him age, watched him suffer beneath the weight of secrets he could no longer share. And then, in 1994, Ernetti died. That, most assumed, was the end. But then something resurfaced, a document, anonymous, strange, delivered through indirect channels to the editors of a book on the Chronovisor. It arrived without fanfare, postmarked from Italy, accompanied by a simple request: keep the sender's identity concealed. The letter, the editors claimed, contained the recorded memory of a final conversation, a testimony spoken by Ernetti on his deathbed to a man described only as a distant relative, a spiritual son, a confession. Its contents were unlike anything Brune, or anyone else, had expected. According to the letter, Ernetti, weak and nearing death, had asked to see this relative one last time. During the visit, he revealed that he had fallen unconscious the night before, and in that state had experienced what he believed to be a near-death passage, a journey toward a light, a presence, a threshold. It was within this liminal space, he claimed, that memories had returned to him, not just from his current life, but from many. He remembered, he said, having lived before. This was not the language of Catholic theology. The Church does not permit belief in reincarnation. The soul, in traditional doctrine, is judged once, after a single life. The idea of multiple incarnations undermines the structure of salvation, penance, redemption. Yet Ernetti, in the final hours of his life, described something entirely different. Not only that he had lived other lives, but that one of them had been shared with Nostradamus. He remembered studying alchemy with the famed seer during the 16th century. He recalled efforts to build a chronovisor even then, though they did not call it that. They had imagined a chamber, spherical in form, lined with vibrating symbols and illuminated manuscripts, a space in which time, as a rigid sequence, dissolved. A room that could access the Akashic records, not metaphorically, but directly. To the dying Ernetti, this past was not symbolic. It was memory. He spoke of the chronovisor not as a machine in the traditional sense, but as a convergence of technology, belief, and metaphysical readiness. It was not enough to build it. One had to be in the right state of mind, of being. He described the final version not as a television or a cabinet, but as a kind of capsule suspended by cables, open at eye level, surrounded in all directions by something like flowing data, light, sound, symbol. The machine, he said, was powered not by electricity, but by consciousness itself. This was not the chronovisor Brune had been told about. It was something stranger, more esoteric. A device that responded not only to technical precision, but to internal resonance. A machine that only functioned when the operator's relationship to time had been fundamentally altered. The implications were dizzying. In this telling, Ernetti had failed not because the machine lacked components, but because he, as a Catholic priest, bound by dogma, could not fully release himself from linear thinking. The machine worked only partially, flickering, incomplete. And so, he had dismantled it, not because it was dangerous, but because he had not yet evolved into the being capable of using it correctly. He believed he would try again, in another life. To those who first read the letter, the effect was disorienting. It felt not like a conclusion, but like the moment a narrative folds inward on itself. All previous chapters, science, secrecy, exorcism, ecclesial authority, were suddenly reframed. The machine had never been only technological, it had always been spiritual. And so, its suppression was not just political, but existential. Brune, when shown the document, was skeptical. He knew Ernetti too well. The language, the imagery, the metaphysics, it did not sound like him. He believed the letter had either been fabricated by someone seeking to discredit Ernetti further, or worse, coerced by those who had silenced him in life. The inconsistencies were too many. The chronovisor Ernetti had described to Brune was physical, an engineered object with mass and circuitry. This version was metaphysical, dreamlike, alchemical. The two could not be reconciled easily. And yet the idea gnawed at the edges of Brune's logic, because the mythic frame fit so well. The machine had always been something more than a device. It had always acted like a symbol, a mirror that reflected not just time, but the consciousness that beheld it. In that sense, perhaps there was no contradiction, only layers. The letter went further. It claimed that the transcript of Thyestes, the ancient Roman tragedy Ernetti once said he had recovered using the chronovisor, had in fact been reconstructed from fragments, preserved citations, scholarly guesses, and, most disturbingly, what Ernetti described as deep memory. He remembered watching the play not through the device, but during a life in which he had been present at the original performance. He was, in his words, not a viewer, but a boy in the audience. The horror of the play, the cannibalistic feast, the madness of revenge had seared itself into his soul, echoing through lifetimes, pulling him to reconstruct it. Whether or not this was delusion or deeper memory, Brune could not say. But it explained something. The obsessive pull Ernetti had felt toward this obscure work, the compulsion to reconstruct it, the strange emotional weight it carried for him. Brune, for all his theological orthodoxy, had to admit the psychology of it made sense. As the letter neared its end, the tone changed. Ernetti spoke more softly, as though aware that his words would be read long after he was gone. He said that his greatest regret was the photograph, the image of Christ on the cross that he had provided to the journalist. He confessed that it was, indeed, not from the Chronovisor. But his reason for offering it had not been deception. It had been hope. He had wanted to inspire belief, to preserve memory, to fill the void left behind when the machine was dismantled. He knew the image was imperfect, derivative, traceable. But he believed the emotional truth it conveyed matched what he had seen. He concluded with a final wish, that his spiritual son, whoever received the letter, would carry the work forward. That someone, someday, would build the machine again, this time more fully, this time without fear. He said he would return, that his soul would try again, that the quest to recover time was not just a scientific endeavor, but a karmic trajectory, one he had followed for centuries, and one he would not abandon in death. Brune, upon reading this, felt a shudder of recognition, not because he believed every word, but because somewhere within the document's strangeness, a deeper pattern emerged. A man had spent his entire life trying to capture the past, not to control it, not to rewrite it, but to understand it fully, without distortion. To witness history not as ideology, but as experience. That alone, Brune thought, was a form of sainthood. The Chronovisor, if it ever existed, no longer does. That is the consensus shared by theologians, scientists, skeptics, and even many who once whispered of its reality. There is no blueprint in circulation, no artifact in a museum, no photograph untainted by suspicion, no tape, no circuit board, no screen. The machine, like a myth carefully erased, has disappeared. And yet, the story remains. What Brune understood in the final years of his life was that erasure is never total. Something always survives. A letter, a rumor, a man's silence. And sometimes that is all history needs to persist. Just enough shadow to suggest a shape that cannot be proven, but cannot be dismissed either. According to Brune's final testimony, the Vatican had not forgotten the Chronovisor. In fact, shortly before Ernetti's death, a final meeting took place. One never recorded publicly, and only revealed in Brune's personal notes. In 1993, Ernetti confided that he had been summoned once more to Rome. The meeting was not for celebration, nor for reconciliation. It was a reckoning. Only 3 of the original scientists were still alive. All were called in. Inside Vatican City, under the authority of a commission whose members were unnamed and undocumented, the remaining architects of the machine gave one final briefing. They explained what the device had done, what it had shown, what had been recorded, and what had been lost. Brune asked Ernetti what came of that meeting. The monk, already fragile, simply replied that they had told them everything. No elaboration, no defense. as if the act of revealing had become its own kind of absolution, or maybe a warning. From that moment forward, Ernetti ceased speaking of the device entirely. His lectures turned exclusively to theology. His public presence receded, and the final chapter of his life unfolded not in mystery, but in a quiet retreat from view. But the questions did not vanish. What had been seen? Who else had seen it? And more unsettling still, why was it hidden? Brune came to believe that the answer was neither spiritual nor scientific. It was political. The Chronovisor, more than anything else, represented the end of authority. It was not just a device that revealed history. It was a device that erased interpretation. And in a world built on narratives, religious, national, institutional, such a device could never be allowed to survive. Because every power structure depends not on truth, but on control over what truth is permitted to become. The machine did not merely reveal events. It revealed motive, contradiction, hypocrisy. It stripped institutions of the luxury of myth. And when that happens, belief itself becomes volatile. That, Brune believed, was why the Chronovisor had to disappear. Not because it didn't work, but because it did. Ernetti, in the final season of his life, carried protection. Not spiritual, physical. He was accompanied by bodyguards. A quiet acknowledgement that some truths are dangerous, not because they threaten the soul, but because they threaten systems. Whether the threat was real or imagined, institutional or clandestine, he never said. But he remained careful. He remained watched. And then he died. But with his death, the story only deepened. Theories proliferated, some mundane, others unhinged, that the device had been sold to private hands, that intelligence agencies had reverse-engineered its principles, that it now sat dismantled beneath Vatican stone, behind a vault too old to remember what it guards. Some pointed to the Vatican secret archives, an institution both real and endlessly mythologized, a place where miles of shelving hold records too powerful or too inconvenient for daylight. Could the machine have been hidden there? Alongside apocryphal gospels, forbidden exorcism texts, and the personal journals of saints whose experiences were too strange to canonize. No one knows. But in one of the last interviews Brune ever gave, he posed a question that would linger long after his voice faded. If you had a device that could see every hidden thing, would you trust anyone with it? He paused, then answered himself. Not even the church, he said. Not even me. The story of the Chronovisor does not end with revelation. It ends where all real mysteries do, with silence. Because the more deeply one contemplates it, the less it feels like a question about a machine, and more like a mirror held up to humanity's obsession with certainty. If such a device ever existed, it would not simply be an invention. It would be a reckoning. It would make liars of historians, artists of priests, and orphans of all who once believed their memories were enough. But perhaps that is why it had to vanish. Not because the world wasn't ready for it, but because it never could be. In the end, the Chronovisor remains what it always was, a story told in a whisper, a ghost in the archives, a device too dangerous to prove, too coherent to dismiss, and too intimate to ignore. And maybe, just maybe, it was never built to show the past. Maybe it was built to test the future and what we would do when we finally saw ourselves.